There are many options that you have for your choice of thread. This is a cotton thread. This is about a 50 weight, which is very fine. This is the cotton sewing thread that I've been using, which is a 40 weight. This is also a quilting cotton, which is a 30 weight. This is actually a buttonhole thread, which is getting a bit heavier. And obviously, if you use that, your stitching is going to be showing up quite a bit more. One that's very commonly used is pearl cotton. This is actually a wonder fill, but it's pretty well the same size. Now, this is not going to show up very much on against that. Now you can see how this is going to show up. And your choice of color is going to depend entirely up to you as to how much you want your thread to show up. And your needle size is going to depend on the thread that you're using. Regardless of the size of thread that you're using, you're going to just be working with a single strand. And the knots will always have to be buried. So I'm going to start, I have my knot in my thread, and I'm going to come in about ½ an inch away from where I'm going to be starting and get my. Now I'm not going through the backing fabric, just through the batting, or just see if you can get just under your top fabric only. Pull that out. And I'm just going to pull hard enough to pull the knot into the fabric. And because I'm left-handed, I'm right-handed, I'm going to sew this way. Your stitching is going to be about ¼ inch. You can pick up the fabric and rock it like this, and your stitch length will improve with practice. And I'm going to pull that through. That first stitch is a bit long. If you're going to be doing any amount of hand quilting, you will want a thimble. Another method is to use your background, your board, as a basis to be able to get your stitches. And you can pick up a couple at the same time. If you're doing a whole quilt, obviously it's going to be a bit different than just doing these few stitches. I do know a lady who does a whole quilt by hand, and she just has it laying in her lap, and she just bunches up the quilt into her hand, and she stitches from the front. And I'm just actually using my fingernail to push the needle through. So if you're going to do a lot of it, you will want to have a thimble. I'm just going to do a couple more stitches, and I'm going to show you how to deal with the knot. Because again, the knot has to be buried into the fabric, because you're not going to be putting a knot on the other side of the fabric, the other side of your quilt. Okay. Just going to tie a knot about ½ an inch away from where my last stitch was. I'm going to make the knot from the other side and see if I can get that onto the same spot. The way we did it before. Now you don't want to have a very large spot here, length, because if you've got your knot way over there, sometimes your stitches can get pulled out and it's not going to work. Again, I'm just going to go under, I'm making the last stitch where the knot is, and I'm going to just go under. I can get into some of the batting. And I'm just going to pop that in, and I'm going to pull up a little bit on this. You can see there's a bit of tension there, so that when I cut the thread, it sinks inside. And that's your hand quilting. Once people have established themselves for hand quilting, they already know what kinds of threads that they prefer to use and which needle. So before you get started for the first one, just make a little sample of your sandwich with the batting and your fabric, and try out the different kinds of threads to see which gives you the effect that you're happy with, and which one you find easiest to work with. Because remember that this quilt is yours, and everything that you do for it is for you and what makes you happy and what works best for you. Because I'm changing thread and thickness of the fabric, because now we have 2 layers of fabric and the batting, I'm going to change my machine setting to woven heavy, and automatically it changed to a stitch length of 3. So I'm just going to give that a try and see how that looks, but also we need to check the tension to make sure that it's still fine. And the top looks okay, and the bottom looks okay. I think that stitch might be a little bit too long, so I'm just going to try it at 2.5 and see how that works. And I think I like that better. I think that will be better. And the thread that I'm using is a cotton quilting thread, and you can see that it's variegated, so it's actually going to create an interesting effect. And when you're choosing your thread, you'll have to decide whether you want the thread to show up or just simply to blend totally into the fabric. One of the most common methods of quilting is to do stitch in the ditch, and either with a straight stitch or using some other fancy stitches. I have a specialized foot that has one of the most common ways to do the quilting is called stitch in the ditch, and essentially what you're going to be doing is stitching right in the ditch of where your block pieces have been joined. And I'm also another method is to do the same thing, except using some kind of a fancy stitch. This foot that I have on here is a problem because it's only for a straight stitch, and if I were to go and use that with any of these stitches that have any width in it, I would break a needle, probably damage the foot, and might cause damage to the machine itself. I do have a specialized foot that has a blade in the middle, and it's specifically designed for doing stitch in the ditch. And what's going to happen is that that blade is running right inside the seams, so it gives you it's an easier way to get your stitching straight. I do find, however, that I have to move my needle position over in one direction. Okay, I'm just moving it over one stitch over, because otherwise you'll have to adjust it, see which way it works better for you. So I'm going, and this also does have a wider opening. It has a wider opening, so I will be able to use this foot even if I'm using some of the fancy stitches. Now I did, oops, there. Now to get started, you're going to, this is the whole quilt. You're going to start from the center and sew outward. Because you're going to be starting the center for a number of different directions, I will sort of offset that. But to get started, I'm going to put my needle down and up to pull up my bobbin threads. this crazy machine. You want to have a long length because you're going to be tying those things off. So now I'm going to start stitching and using this blade, and I am using the blade. The stitching is actually on this fabric, so I'm going to, with the needle up, and I'm going to move my needle over a bit so that it misses it. Now that's better. Now to finish this seam, needle down, because we want to pull up the thread, the bobbin thread, because we're going to be tying the threads and burying the threads, the thread ends. So it makes it easier. Obviously, well, first of all, we do have to pull up that thread from the bobbin, but it makes it easier if you give yourself a long thread. And this is where I usually have my tweezers. And now I can continue sewing in the other direction. I was thinking about doing a decorative stitch on here, so I did a bit of a test swatch to see which one I would like to use, and having the variegated thread, it gives a very different effect for the stitching. So especially with that in mind, you may want to think very hard about using variegated thread. So I've pulled up my bobbin thread, to rethread my and I'm going to stitch this. And it turned out okay. And on the back, we're going to deal with all these threads. First of all, I'm going to tie a knot with two of the threads, and we're going to bury the thread into the quilt. So I'm going to start by making a bit of a knot, and if you have very short threads, you can get your needle positioned first of all, and then with the needle threader pick up the threads. But these are long enough that I can just use the needle threader to pick up my threads. And I'm going to bury the threads. I'm going to go in as where the knot was placed, and make sure that you just go through the top layer and the batting, not through the backing fabric. And pull this out, and I'm going to give this a bit of a tug just to give a bit of tension, and snip it, and it disappears. For extra security, you can actually use put on a dab of Fray Check onto the knot. This is a permanent glue. It will not wash out, and that way you know for sure that then that will dry up invisible, and you know that your knot is never going to come undone. Another very common method of quilting is to do a grid. I've sewn my first line of stitching, and this is a quilt guide that is attached to a little hole behind the shank of the foot. So I've set this at 1.5 inches, but obviously you can figure out how wide you want your grid to be. And if you're not quite sure, you can simply lay a piece of thread across your fabric and another one across at varying widths to see what's going to work for you. Right now I've got this set at 1.5, so I'm going to follow, the guide is going to follow along that line of stitching that's already established. And now I can do the other side because it's already established, and just simply carry on. Now to do the other thread, the other line of stitching, you can have it go square, or you can have it going at an angle, so you're actually creating a diamond shape. The only problem is if you're depending on the thread color that you're using, this can become about the quilting rather than about the pattern or the fabric that you have on the quilt top. So that's where you particularly want to carefully consider the color of your thread and how large you're going to make the grid. Here's another option for doing a type of a grid. I have this wavy line template, and I've sewn the first seam, and so we're going to do a grid, but how far do I make it match, or do I offset it slightly? And that makes it look, this over an extended area, having it offset like that will actually give it sort of a different wavy pattern compared to just simply doing that. I think 1.5 inches is probably still going to be a fair distance, but, and I'm just going to measure to make sure that it's matching up. But instead of being straight on, I think offsetting it, but offsetting it looks a little bit better when it's lower. So I'm just going to trace this and stitch that line. And then of course you're back to the question again of doing the opposing lines, and I think that I would just do them directly to make a square rather than to make it like a diamond type of a pattern. And I have reduced my stitch length from 2.5 down to 2 because going around these curves you'll want a shorter stitch length so that you have better control to make that curve smoother. Another option is free motion, and essentially there's two elements of it that are very important. Number one, first of all, it actually drops the feed dogs, so the feed dogs are not grabbing the fabric and pushing it through. The second thing is that there's a specialized foot that is used because as it's sewing, the normal pressure foot maintains constant pressure on the fabric as it's going through, but this foot actually bounces up and down to put pressure on the fabric as it's stitching. So if you don't have a free motion option on your machine, simply dropping your feed dogs is not going to give you the same effect or the control, because because the second part of it is to have this oscillating or this bouncing presser foot that does create some pressure on the fabric that you're not going to get just using a regular presser foot. The principle behind free motion also is that you will learn what speed that you're going to go at, and actually because you no longer have the feed dogs that are pushing the fabric through, you're the one who is controlling the fabric and where it's going. And it's better to have it at a shorter stitch length, but you will learn yourself the speed at which you're comfortable with to get your stitching done. And this is just a meander, and normally you try not to cross over the stitching that you've already done. And to learn how to do this, I simply took an old pillowcase, put a layer of batting into it, and did a lot of practicing that way. And that is free motion stitching, quilting.